Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Simona D'Alessio, and I am a researcher and consultant in inclusive education and disability studies. I'm also a former support teacher, and I have been working with students with disabilities in mainstream classroom for more than 10 years. I would like to thank Family Advocacy and Karen in particular for having invited me to contribute from remote to your conference today. I'm very sorry I cannot be there in person, but I had other work commitments that didn't allow me to travel all the way from Rome to Australia, even though I really wanted to be there. Not just because Australia is a beautiful country, but because I really think that you are facing an important historical moment as far as education is concerned. You need to make a very important choice. Either you can decide to follow the well-trodden path, so to say, of special needs education and segregation, or you can make another choice and follow the less trodden path and choose inclusive education and have all students in the same common learning environment. And I think this is a very difficult choice to make. I understand your concerns, your worries, but I'm here to share with you the experience of Italy. After we made that decision to have all students educated in a common learning environment, and what happened after 40 years since we made that choice. So I really would like to share with you my experience from my country and the people and the students and the teachers and the parents that we interviewed 40 years after that decision was made. Thank you. School integration was passed in 1977, and it led to the dismantling of all special schools and to the closing down of differentiated classes. It was a very important choice to make, and certainly Italy was favored by a very democratic constitutional charter that allowed and required the participation of all students in the state schools. While other countries were basically trying to understand whether it was a good thing to educate children with disability in the regular school and the common learning environments, Italy was already looking at ways in which they could improve the quality of provision, the quality of support for all students, regardless of their socioeconomic background or whether they belong to ethnic minorities or whether they had physical or intellectual impairments. And it was certainly an easy choice to make because there were situations in which schools certainly were not ready to welcome the students. But they had no choice to do otherwise, and they had to work hard to reorganize their structure and their system and their organization in order to welcome all students. It's very important to understand that inclusion and integration do not mean the same thing, and they are not synonyms. So in Italy, we developed a policy of integration, but we are certainly looking at ways in which we can make that policy and that school practice that is currently integrative a more inclusive one. So integration is about including and mainstreaming children with disability that were formerly excluded or marginalized into the regular school setting, the mainstream setting. And inclusion instead has got nothing to do with the process of mainstreaming children into regular settings, into mainstream schools. But it's about making regular schools, ordinary classes, inclusive from the start so that they can allow the participation of all students in the process of learning. So really, while the focus of integration is on students and what is not working in them, so that the school can do the best they can in order to adapt, to modify, to compensate for the individual lacks of the students and allow them to be fixed somehow, to take part, to participate in the lessons. The focus of inclusion is different. Inclusion is looking at what is not working within the education system and what barriers are still there in place for example, the rigidity of the curriculum or the traditional ways of teaching and learning. So what are the barriers that are still in place in the education system that do not allow the participation of all students, including those with individual impairment? So as you can see, there are big differences between the two. And at the moment in Italy, we are looking at ways in which we can improve the inclusive quality of our education system. But certainly, integration was a fundamental step to initiate this process of change of the education system. Without integration, without placing all students in the same learning environment, we would have never started the process of change that is required to make ordinary school for all students. So the benefits of inclusive education are certainly manifold. In Italy, we have started with the policy of integration, and we are now looking at ways in which we can make our integrative system as inclusive as possible. So the benefits are at different levels for different stakeholders. Of course, the most important ones are the benefits for children with disabilities themselves. We have conducted research that shows that the quality of learning for students with disability who are educated in mainstream setting is far better than the quality of learning both socially and academically of students who are educated in segregated setting. So that's the first thing, the benefits for children with disabilities and their outcomes are both socially and academically. The second important benefit is certainly for students without disability, because they become better adults when they grow up with children with disability in the same educational setting. And this is also shown by research that provide evidence where adults who have been educated with children with disability when they were younger become adults who are aware of social and attitudinal and economic barriers that needs to be removed to allow those peers, those classmates with disability, to become active members of society. And of course, we have other benefits at the level of parents, because parents have shown that in their interviews we conducted that they are less worried about what will happen after they are not there anymore, and their children will become adults and will have to enter the workplace, or maybe they will be able to enter university because they have been already within the mainstream setting. They have also told us about a reduction in the stigmatization procedure that were in place when their children were segregated in special settings. We have also benefits for teachers who have reported becoming better teachers. I'm talking about classroom teachers after they have been teaching children with disabilities. And of course, we have a lot of benefits for society as a whole. What type of society do we want to develop for the 21st century? So if we want a society where values such as solidarity, democracy, justice, fight against discrimination is the type of society we want, especially in a climate like this one that is characterized by terrorist attack and risk of wars. If we want a society that really value what we think is important, and then we really need to pursue a policy of inclusion. When I was teaching at university, I was asking my students, who were university students, their experiences in the classroom with students with disabilities. And they all reported that they had classmates with disability when they were at grammar school or the elementary school, and they all reported that for them it was absolutely normal to be educated in the same common learning environment with them. And the experience made them better individuals as adults, because I'm sure that most of them, and this is also research, they will become the architects or engineers or the policymakers of the future, they will remember the experience they had with classmates with disabilities, and they will be mostly aware of the barriers and that needs to be removed to create a more inclusive society. So it will be normal for them to ensure that buildings, for example, have accessibility ramps, or that theaters and social places are fully accessible for all students because they remember the experience they had with their peers with disability. And similarly, when I told them in one of my lessons that segregation was a choice for students with disability in most countries around the world, they couldn't believe that something like that was happening. And they thought that that was something completely against justice, against the law. So it tells us about what type of society. And I'm not saying that it is an easy choice to make. I'm not saying that these students are the best students in the world, but certainly gives you an idea of the type of support that they can provide when they will become employers or the future policy makers. There is something I would like to share with you in order to help you develop an inclusive system in Australia. But certainly try not to mistake the means for the end. Basically, the means being the process of integrating and mainstreaming children with disability in the regular classroom, and the end being developing an inclusive education system. So it's very important that we don't stop at the level of placing students in regular setting and we think that it's something that we consider as being inclusive, because that's only the first step. Inclusive education is not just about dumping, so to say, children with disability in unmodified regular classroom. Inclusive education is about changing regular classroom, changing mainstream education settings. And changes have to be made at the level of curriculum, for example, developing flexible, adaptive curriculum that respond to the different requirements of all students. Changes at the level of pedagogy. I'm thinking about research that's talk about inclusive pedagogy and inclusive universal learning as a way forward to develop inclusive pedagogy. And changes at the level of organization and the way in which the school is organized, and at the level of assessment. Develop forms of assessment that are inclusive, for example, by developing assessment for learning, assessment that is used by teachers to understand the progress made by students so that they can plan their next steps in teaching. All these changes is what make a school, an inclusive school, able to respond to the requirements of all children, including children with disabilities. I think this is a very important question to ask and also to answer. What we learn after 40 years of integration in my country is that in order to develop an inclusive system, it's very important that classroom teachers are made accountable for the learning outcomes of children with disabilities. Usually what we saw that in our country, when support teachers spend most of their time teaching children with disability in the mainstream classroom, we have witnessed the phenomenon of the delegation. And what happens is that we have the reproduction of the special school, so to say, the special classroom within the same classroom, where students with disability are taught separately within the same classroom or sometimes in a special unit outside the classroom directly by the support teacher. And this is not something that should be happening. So it's very important that in the policy you are developing in Australia, you make the classroom teacher fully responsible for the education and the learning outcomes of students with disabilities. That means that support teachers and learning support assistants are very much needed within the mainstream classroom, but they should be working with the classroom teacher in order to improve his or her capacity to work with the whole population of the students they have in the classroom. There's a very interesting directive, a ministerial directive. It was passed in Canada, and I know you are working also with people from Canada and the Northern Western Territory directive that argues that support teacher should spend 60% of their time in supporting classroom teachers and basically improving the quality of the overall instruction in the classroom. And then they should be spending 25% of their time teaching directly students with disabilities inside or outside the classroom whenever needed. And finally, 15% of their time should be spent on looking at planning or organizational duties. But this is only to remind you that it's very important that classroom teachers are the ones that try to, as much as they can, to differentiate, to personalize their teaching strategies and their learning objectives so that students with disability can really become a full member of the classroom. Well, first of all, it's very important that we work at the level of culture, the change at the level of culture. So develop a campaign, a cultural awareness campaign that impacts the way in which disability is currently interpreted and conceived in your country. So it's very important that we look at disability not as an attribute of the person, as something that has to do with the person, individual deficits of the person, but we should try to look at disability as an experience lived by a person with individual impairments as a result of the way in which society and schools in particular are currently structured and organized. So disability should be interpreted in terms of social, cultural, attitudinal barriers that need to be removed. It's not about individual deficit. It's not an individual problem. Having said that, if you manage to develop a cultural change in the way in which disability is considered and interpreted, especially involving parents in this cultural awareness campaign, you have done already a lot. And partnerships with parents are certainly important because parents are an organization that should play a crucial central role, not just as consultants but as decision makers and as leaders, and when decisions need to be taken. And it's very important, especially for children with disability themselves, if you involve people with disability as role models, because usually people with disabilities and young students with disability need to have role models as people that have gained success, that can make decisions, that can be leaders, not just as people that receive assistance and support by sort of non-disabled people. Another important thing is that when you involve people with disability, you ask them about their past and if they have been educated in special schools, because the literature usually has shown that when people with disabilities were educated in segregated settings, their memories of those days are not positive memories, and they usually report that they succeed despite being educated in a segregated setting. So tell us about a lot why inclusive education is currently needed. Another important step to take is try to understand what is the role of special schools currently working in Australia. And of course, it's very important to say that we need the expertise and the staff knowledge that is in special schools in Australia today, as we need in every part of the world. And but the only problem is that that expertise should be used to improve the capacity of the mainstream setting rather than being something that is located in one special setting, one special school. So special schools could be changed and transformed into resource centers that help local state schools or local mainstream schools to become more inclusive. They can support the local school in different ways. They could support the school by, for example, sharing the materials, including IT, when this is needed, or special resources, aids that can be shared across the school whenever these materials are needed. They can provide teacher training. They can provide training for parents so they know what to do with the children when their children are at home. And they can provide support, for example, as a link with the medical service, with the health services, whenever this is required. So it's very important that that expertise doesn't go lost. Another important thing is that school and learn to cooperate with other schools. So school-to-school cooperation, clusters of schools working together, maybe together with the support of a special schools that become their center of excellence, is certainly something we are looking into in Italy as well, to develop a better system of inclusion.
Don't you love Italy, where the passion runs deep and the social justice runs even deeper? I'd just like to quickly acknowledge the arrival for our afternoon session of the Federal Shadow Minister for Schools, Andrew Giles. Welcome. And then sticking in the federal parliament area, having studied education and a strong interest in disability policy, which is basically, you know, the double whammy that we want up here. Emma Husar was elected to federal parliament in the seat of Lindsay in 2016. Mother of three. Emma's lived experience as a mum to Mitch, who has a disability, saw her, among other things, receive the Penrith City Council Care of the Year Award for her work on behalf of people with disabilities. It's my honour to introduce Emma to the stage. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you here today. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on traditional land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And in acknowledging country and acknowledging Aboriginal people, recommit myself to ending the scourge that is Aboriginal disadvantage. And I never get tired of acknowledging country, but for the first time in my life of standing up and speaking to a large group of people, I was confronted the other day about why I acknowledge country. And this gentleman said to me, "Oh, do you acknowledge the white people that brought us out of the dark ages as well?" And I kind of had to say, well, you know, wherever I need to still answer those questions, I will still need to acknowledge country. We need to acknowledge country that you know, it's more common for a young person to end up in jail than to end up at university. So I think it's a really important part of what we do, and I never want it to get to being a box-ticking exercise for any of us. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here with my colleague, Andrew Giles, who is the Shadow Minister for Education, and must say, it's quite weird to be a backbencher and have a Shadow Minister in my audience. It's very commonly the other way around. But it speaks to the level of respect and the level of regard that my colleagues afford me as a person with a lived experience of disability, that they sometimes take a back seat and listen to what I've got to say, even though Andrew's much smarter on me on most other things and much more well-versed. So thank you, Andrew, for being here. I also want to acknowledge that we're here with the Commissioner, Alistair McEwen. Had a lot to do with his predecessor, Graham Innes, and it's nice to see a young person stepping into that job, and I hope that he'll be around for a really long time, making sure that we've got the right things and the right supports in place. And Jody Carr, the Special International Visitor, I did see him earlier. He's left. Oh, he's in an interview, awkward. Don't tell him that I acknowledged him and he wasn't here. And I just want to say thank you very much to Family Advocacy for inviting me today. And it's really inspirational to be here with so many people who are interested in making sure that we get this right and support inclusion right across our school sector. Gina was right, I studied education way back in the day. It wasn't that long ago, I'm not that old. It was long enough to call it in at least a decade ago. And so when I studied education, it was still at the time where we had 35 kids in a public school classroom. It was at a time where the ADHD epidemic was really sort of, you know, pronounced, and we didn't really know what to do with kids that presented to school with ADHD. It was at a time where there wasn't any individual funding for kids unless they were really quite severely disabled, and I'm pleased to say that we've come a little way since then, but I realised at that time I couldn't stay there doing education. I needed to rewrite policy and actually contribute in a different way, so I quit and I did something else for a little while. I am the mother of 3 children, and I have a 15 and a 11 and 9-year-old. I do remember their names occasionally also. Sally mentioned Evie, and Mitch is now 11 and into his final term of Year 5. It's an interesting time. Many of the parents who are here will know what that transition from high school, or from primary school rather, to high school is like. And after nearly all of his life being included in a mainstream setting, I'm now being offered a support class. I'm like, I'm sorry, what now? Why would I need that? What are the options here? And for him, after all of that time in an included class, to now be at that stage where high school is actually not going to be able to support him, because there are too many kids, there are too many changes, there is not enough funding, and we're going to be going into high school when that $17 billion of federal funding cuts kick in. And so as a mum, it sucks to be me right now. I'm making that decision, and it is really, really quite difficult. His needs don't require the level of a support class, but he also has had the benefit of being in a mainstream class for... We've got to work around and we will get there, but it's a bit of a blight on this country where we have a situation where the only opportunity for him being offered is a support class. But that's not kind of where it's started for us. I took him originally to his sister's primary school, and she's a bit older than him, and she'd been there for a couple of years. We had a change of principal, and I said, I want to get my son an enrolment form. And, everybody in the school kind of knew about Mitch and knew that, he was diagnosed and all the rest of it. And he has autism spectrum disorder and a couple of other comorbid diagnoses, ADHD, anxiety, he has a speech and learning delay. Anyway, so the principal says, I think we've got too many stairs. I'm sorry, what now? You have too many stairs? He could actually jump on 2 feet before he could walk properly, and certainly do many more things before stairs were a challenge. I don't think he could talk, but he could certainly bound down the street at 100 miles an hour with me chasing after him. So stairs weren't going to be an issue, but that was the level of understanding of this school principal. I thought, man, how did you get here? A, you're a principal, and B, you've obviously been around a really long time. And they were the sorts of things that I was confronted with. I became quite a passionate advocate for special needs people, and before coming into the Parliament I served on Penrith City Council's Access Committee, because one of the things that I don't think we do very well in this country is recognise things we can't see. If your kids are diabetic, or if they're in a wheelchair, or if they have epilepsy, those things are provable. But if your kid has mental health issues, if you have an intellectual disability, or if you're autistic, you can't prove that. There is no test. Well, really, we do our ASQs and our PCAT assessments and all of those things, but there is no x-ray or blood test or scan that we can give to these kids and say, yeah, this is actually the degree to which this child is impaired. People sort of see it as subjective. So the biggest example that I've got of that is when I was during the campaign, because, the media is so friendly, especially the Conservative media are really friendly to Labor candidates in marginal seats. And so everything's up for grabs. Last week in the Daily Telegraph, I was a dual citizen on page 3, and on page 7, it's like Husar has no issues. And, I'm like, I'm confused now. Which is it? Is it am I in or am I out? So we had a family photo shoot down by the river, and the Australian photographer came down and the journalist, and they're interviewing me. And I realised afterwards that it was actually a test. They didn't care what they were doing there. They were there to suss my kid out. And I'm like, okay, fine. And they sort of said in the end, but he doesn't look like he's got a disability. And I'm like, I didn't realise you were a developmental paediatrician. Thank you very much. Can I get you to assess my kid now? This is a journalist who's telling me or challenging me after I've raised this kid for like 10 years, and I have a file like probably any parent in this room that is this big of the things that he can do and the things that he can't do. And so I went, this was just a fishing expedition for these guys. And then I had to prove at some point, because a journalist was accusing me of not having a child with special needs. I'm like, oh my God, seriously, I can't face palm hard enough, because this is, the kind of life that I'm in. And so if a journalist can come after me in my position because of, their perceived bias, how does everybody else see my child? If they think that he doesn't have a disability, all of the things that I've known to be anecdotally true is that this country really has a problem with recognising things that we can't test for is actually a big problem. So before I came into the Parliament, I got to build some inclusive playgrounds, and Sean Rapley, if you're here, put your hand up. Oh, there he is, hey. Sean's also helped build inclusive playgrounds with Touch by Olivia for the last 7 or 8 years together. And make sure that we have spaces for kids who need them that are inclusive. Make sure that we have a physical environment through the Access Committee that I was on that is inclusive. Make sure that... I spoke about dunnies in my inaugural speech to Parliament. Now, any of you can, more than welcome to go and see if anyone else has ever spoken about dunnies in their inaugural speeches to Parliament, but talked about the importance of inclusive toilets, because we are so far behind on the way society acknowledges and includes people. And I guess that was no more clearer than when we had my good friend Pauline Hanson, you know, just casually get up in the Senate and say that half the kids that were there didn't belong there. And the worst thing about that, and I'm just going to take it all as read that you've seen my response. My favourite thing about that was telling my son what I'd done, and he's like, "No, you didn't." I go, "Yeah, I did." And then he watched, he's like, "You're a legend." So anyway, props from him. But the worst thing about that nobody got to see was that I actually approached her the day that she'd done it, and I gave her the opportunity to be educated, to be made aware. The important thing with Pauline is to know that she's actually not that stupid. She's actually quite smart, and this feeds into those people who vote for her. And she wasn't interested. And so then I went from kind of anger level 4 to about anger level 450. And I walked back into my office and I kicked my shoes off, and I'm like, "I've had enough. Like, what do you mean? Like, this is crazy." And I stayed up all night because I was just so white hot with anger, and I think that came across the next day. So then I decided that I'd just call a press conference and deal with it there and then, and just reset that bar for every kid in every single school or adult or anybody who'd ever felt discriminated against. So I'm incredibly proud that I was able to do that. And you know, there are people now, I spoke to 60 kids last week in a school who talked about it, and then a little girl had the courage to put a hand up and say, "I'm autistic and I have ADHD and I have anxiety," in front of 60 of her peers. And I said, "Well, you know, cool, that's all right with me. Is it all right with you guys?" And they're all like, "Yeah, that's cool." And I'm like, there you go. So I think a few years ago, a child with those kinds of things, I got the red card. A child with those kinds of disabilities or differences wouldn't have had that courage. So I think in terms of society, we have a long way to go to get this right, not just in our education system, but across our society as a whole. I'm working on some early screening for kids with autism. We've done really well in the hearing space to almost have I think we do have the lowest rate of hearing loss in our children. And really just happy to be in the Parliament where what I say can make a difference, and what I've been through and my experience can make a difference, and to use that power to change things with colleagues like Andrew and Tanya, who are quite willing and able to listen to what those experiences are like. I've got lots of friends in those communities through those lived experiences, that this is not just something you read about. These kids exist and they're important too. So thank you for having me here today. Good luck with the rest of the day's activities, and I'm always happy to have questions, although I don't think that we're going to quite get to that. No, Gina's screwing a face up. She said, "If I get to the edge of the stage, you're in real strife." So thank you all for being here. Please keep up the work that you are doing in your respective fields to ensure that we not only end up with more inclusivity in our classrooms, but also as society. Once we've educated these kids at school, they also need to get jobs, and I didn't ever get to start on that. So thank you, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you, Emma. She makes me sound like I'm a tyrant. So we're actually going to head to the other side of the world. And let me just find my space here. And invite Dr. Carol Quirk into our ballroom from Maryland. Carol is one of the founders of the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education and serves on the executive team for the SWIFT Centre, which is a National Inclusive School Reform Centre. So I think Carol's going to come up via Skype. I'm feeling like I'm having a little bit of a Brady Bunch moment for anyone that's old enough to remember. So I'll let Carol take it away. Thank you, Carol.
Very pleased to be here. I am the director of the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education, and I've had the opportunity to work on inclusive practices in Maryland and in other states. And so what I want to do today is share with you some of my experiences, and I'm going to put up a PowerPoint slide here. Here we go. So I hope you all can see that. So I'm going to talk about the why, the what, why and how of inclusive education. Professor Slee, I think, referred to this as kind of an important framework that we should be thinking about. When I think about inclusive education, it's based on the experiences I've had in the last 30 years working with schools and districts. So in the United States, we have school districts that are governed by our states, and the districts are the entities that provide supports to our schools. And so when we think about what is inclusion, we want to think about what's going on in the classroom, not just the place. Have any of you heard, for example, inclusion doesn't work for all students, or some kids can't be included, or some kids need small group instruction and we can't do that in regular ed. We have 25, 28 students in a class and we really can't spare the time to include students with disabilities. And to all of that, I would echo the words of Mr. Carr earlier, which is that's not inclusion. If it's, quote, not working, the student is not really included. They're just physically there. So the work of developing an inclusive school is exactly that. It's making change and school reform. It's about having a sense of belonging so that students with disabilities feel like they're a part of the school community and other children also feel like they're a part of the school community. In an inclusive school, students with disabilities are participating in all aspects of life of the school, including the extracurricular activities and the assemblies and the functions that are both academic and non-academic. We think about each and every student. Many of you may have heard the term all means all. And we use that often among many of our communities to really try to get across the meaning of all students. But I keep hearing, echoing in my mind when I am in some schools, well, all students, but, well, not those students. So I've begun to start using the term each and every student. It's every student without exception. And we're focused on the success for all students, not just those with disabilities. So in our early work with school buildings, looking at schools as the unit of change, schools as the place where implementation occurs. We went in through the special education door, working with the special education director, working with the special education staff, and of course the general educator that was receiving students and the principal. But we really didn't focus strongly on the quality of the general education teacher and the practices that they engaged in. And so we found ourselves perhaps doing some good planning for individual students, but we weren't always placing them in classrooms where the teaching was really effective. So one of the things we've done is to really look at what's going on in the classroom. We don't want this. You see in that corner, Fred, who uses a wheelchair, with a teaching assistant. And Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Cooper are trying to figure out why poor Fred doesn't feel like a part of his class. Well, this is not a classroom where inclusion is going to be successful because Fred is, frankly, not included. In inclusive classes, we don't have inclusive teachers because if we have inclusion teachers, what is everybody else? They're exclusion teachers. In an inclusive school, we don't have inclusive classes because then what is everything else but an exclusion class? We also don't have classes that are labeled by the name of a disability or a program. We have classes with names of grades or numbers. It is also not a class where you have a large proportion of students with disabilities and then also students who are struggling. Teachers tell us over and over that that is a very hard class to teach. And frankly, they have a hard time keeping up with the standards. So when we think about a school that's truly inclusive, we think about the practices of the educators, the practices of the leadership. Inclusion is not a program. It's not a place. It's how a school operates. So these 4 areas are areas that I'm going to talk about a little bit. The placement and participation of a student in the school, what happens among the educators as they work together, how teachers actually teach, and how do we provide supports and interventions for those students who are struggling, whether they're students with disabilities or students who may speak other languages and are learning English for the first time, students who live in poverty, or who are from other cultures. So in terms of placement and participation, is the student in a school that they would attend if they did not have a disability? Are they in an age-appropriate general ed classroom with a typical schedule like everyone else? I would also extend that idea of a typical schedule to how things operate within the classroom. Sometimes if a student has more extensive needs, teachers will try to buddy up that student with a peer, which is a great idea. But if the student with a disability is always the one being helped, teachers need to be really careful that they're not setting up a situation where the student with a disability is in a patronized situation. We want to provide supports for that student to be engaged in the classroom and in all parts of the school, as well as all school activities. The biggest barrier that I have encountered in almost 30 years is time. The way schools are structured in traditional fashion, there's usually not time built into the schedule for special educators and general educators to actually co-plan so that they can co-teach and co-assess students. We have been able to work with schools to reorganize how they schedule so that there is time for co-planning as well as co-teaching. But it requires that administrators give up the idea of being the master of their schedule and allow others into that process. Another big movement that we're seeing right now is in the use of data. There's a large push to have reading and literacy and numeracy data screening systems so that educators can make informed decisions, not only using the kinds of testing that they may do in their classroom, but some more norm reference testing as well as qualitative testing. Some of the data is not coming from a literal test, but it may be from situational assessments that they do in the classroom. The biggest barrier we find here is that teachers don't always know how to use data. So this is an area where our universities need to step up, and we're finding our school districts need to provide additional training or support in how teachers can collaborate together to use data to make good instructional decisions. And then there are going to be students who may not be responding to the general instruction, even with additional support, may not be quite learning in the way that teachers think they can and should. So teachers need to know how to design individual supports for those students with more intensive needs. Now here again, you can put a general education teacher and a special educator together in a room, and they may figure it out. They may come up with a very good plan. But sometimes they're challenged if they don't really together have all of the knowledge to figure out how to make that 30 minutes of planning time efficient. So we've come up with some forms and structures that will help teachers plan, and I'll show you one before we finish this presentation. So the curriculum and instruction would be delivered by both general and special educators. I go into classrooms way too often where the general educator is teaching the class and the special educator is floating around the room helping individual students who may have disabilities or who may be struggling to learn. Worst case scenario, they're standing on the side trying to figure out what they should do. There are actually really good co-teaching structures, and so a lot of the training that we do and support to schools is teaching teachers how to teach together and how to select the type of co-teaching structure that matches both the students and the content that they're trying to teach. You may have heard about Universal Design for Learning. And if you haven't, you should look it up. That is a wonderful way of looking at how to design instruction from the beginning so that more learners can access it who may be struggling to learn. teachers are using more and more flexible groups so that in addition to the whole class instruction and maybe some independent work, they're creating flexible groups based on either ability level or by student interest, or they're creating different stations for students to engage in the work in different ways. When teachers do this and set up students to work together cooperatively, peers can actually mentor each other and students can learn from each other, as well as having different opportunities to work on the content. Teachers will then also develop lessons that will address the individual goals of students who may have very unique needs. And finally, supports and interventions for those students with disabilities or who have other kinds of unique needs really should have planning with family input, really should include how peers can be involved in the learning and teaching of those skills, figuring out what materials need to be modified or what technology might be added, and then thinking of the specialized cues, prompts, and feedback. Teachers have often relied on words to teach, and we know that there are many other ways to prompt students and decrease dependence on teacher giving verbal directions. So why include? Now, I imagine that all of you wouldn't be here if you didn't think inclusion was a good idea. So I'll just run through some of the research so that you may have this at your hand if you're talking to someone else. This young guy has autism, he has ADHD, and he is nonverbal. Why should he be included? Well, we know from research that there are many benefits of putting students in general ed classes and actually including them in instruction. We know that students are more engaged and there's more instructional time for students with disabilities when they're included. We know that they make more academic progress. This is a summary of different studies, and I just put this in. I know you can't read all of it, nor do you want to, but there are several different studies that have looked at the instruction of students with disabilities in general education, and without exception, they have found that students have gains in academic skills, adaptive behavior, and social skills when they're included, compared with a similar group of students in self-contained classes. Research is also focused on friendships. Now, a lot of these studies are very small, might be with a group of students with Down syndrome or a group of elementary students. However, when you look at all of these studies together, we get a clear pattern of the social benefits of inclusive education. Sometimes we have true friendships, and sometimes we have social opportunities. In either case, these are experiences that students would not have if they were in a separate self-contained classroom. When I was first starting this work, what families would tell me is stories about how students were, for the first time, invited to a birthday party of someone in their neighborhood, or that they had a sleepover with another child. And these are things that their child would not have experienced previously. This is some really interesting research that has been going on in the US. There's a national longitudinal transition study, and they followed students over 2 years, 5 years, and they're now working on 10 years. And in this particular report, they noted that students who were spending 80% of the time or more in general education classrooms, they were twice as likely to enroll in college when compared with students who spent less time in inclusive classes. Another similar study out of this longitudinal study found that students who were included in high school were more likely to be employed after high school. So these are really important implications for being included in the later years. Some recent research is really interesting because it's looking at location. A colleague of mine, Jenny Kurth at the University of Kansas, has 2 or 3 studies out now where she's looked at the placement patterns in different states, East Coast, West Coast, rural, suburban, and urban, looked at racial compositions. And basically, what she has found is that when students are living in suburban, more well-to-do areas, and it's more highly likely that they're white, they're more likely to be included, in contrast to urban settings with a wider racial diversity and more poverty. So here we have a situation where the practices in a location are influencing the outcomes of students, and with a more negative outcome for students with higher rates of poverty and students who are more likely to be non-white. So we have a discriminatory situation that results from policy and practice. What about students without disabilities? These students are making more progress in reading and math as well. Whoops. There was a large study of about 2,000 students in the state of Indiana, and they compared students in what they call traditional classes with no students with disabilities, as well as those in inclusive classes that did have students with reading and emotional disabilities. And students without disabilities had greater gains in reading and math compared to their non-inclusive settings. The authors figured that they did not actually measure teaching, but they looked at the amount of collaboration that was occurring and concluded that the teaching style actually improved when teachers had students with disabilities in the class. There were several other studies of students without disabilities, and they're often small, and they often look at very specific skills. So the other bullets here give you examples of other findings of the benefits to students without disabilities. There's no study that has shown that students without disabilities are negatively impacted by inclusion. So besides the learning that occurs for students with and without disabilities, the other arguments have to do with equity, opportunity, and society. Students with disabilities should have a right to the same high quality education as students without disabilities. We know that there's increased opportunity for learning friends and experiencing the rhythms and routines of life that other kids have. There's no reason why kids with disabilities should not have those same opportunities. As a society, we're preparing children without disabilities to be the future employers, parents, neighbors, friends, co-workers of people with disabilities. So what a greater opportunity do we have to create a diverse and inclusive society of the future by including our students now. So those are the whys of inclusion. But how do we go about it? Including students with disabilities is about change. It's about transformation. And like Professor Slee said earlier, it's about school reform. It's not about placing a student in a classroom. It's about how the whole school looks at their school community. In the work that I do with schools, we begin by looking at 3 kinds of important planning. And this takes, in a school building, at least 3 years per school. When we've worked with a whole district, not too long ago with a district of 30 schools, we systematically phased in 4 schools at a time or 8 schools at a time each year into the process of planning. So at the district level, which would be a governing level over the school, we created an action planning team. And the team looked at the professional development needs, aligning priorities and practices, and the policies that they had in place, and the supports that they could provide to the schools that are participating. As schools came into this 3-year process, they began developing action plans with family involvement. They looked at their practices and their organizational structures, as well as what was happening in the classroom. And then for students who need it, we have an individual student planning process. Every student with a disability doesn't need it, but some students do. So to understand the framework, we begin with helping schools think about what they're doing now. And so across the school, we look at student behavior support. Do they have a preventive approach a proactive teaching approach for social behavior that's positive and engaging and accepting of all students? Do they have a curriculum that's based in research? Is the school, as a policy, promoting the use of universal design for learning frameworks? Do they have a process for planning and scheduling students so that they're naturally proportioned across the school and not congregated in a few classrooms? When you look at the classroom level, are teachers really implementing good, positive classroom management routines and high quality co-teaching structures? Are students engaged, and are their lessons based on UDL principles? Are teachers competent in providing culturally responsive instruction and including students with disabilities as part of the lesson? Are they addressing the language learning needs of students whose first language is not English? And for students who are displaying behavior that may be challenging, is there a tiered system where you have additional supports for students who need it, and then very uniquely designed behavior plans for students who need that very intensive progress monitoring and intensive support so that they learn more appropriate social behavior? Are there tiered systems for students in literacy and numeracy in particular, so that at a tier 2, they're getting supplemental reading or supplemental numeracy instruction, or at a tier 3, they're getting very individually designed instruction so that they learn literacy and numeracy skills? Now, I'm not talking necessarily about students with disabilities, although it may be many students who need the tier 2 or tier 3 more intensive supports. But when the school structures itself like this, students with disabilities become part of a whole school community, and any student can come in and out of an intervention at any time based on their learning. And finally, in that lower right-hand corner, are teams using individual student planning processes, like the one I'll show you in a couple of minutes. So the school-based planning is a 3-year process and 2 more years for sustainability. Year 1 is planning and professional development. The literature tells us over and over that schools need to learn how to be collaborative. They need professional learning in how to make the accommodations, modifications, and implement strategies to teach a variety of learners with disabilities. We've learned that in our process, we target grades to start. So in a primary school, we may focus only on 1st and 2nd grade, or a school that I'm working with this year is focusing on kindergarten and 4th grade. The reasons they target grades are unique to the school. It could be based on the professional capacity of the educators, the particular students who are in those grades. So in the 2nd year, they implement inclusive practices in those targeted grades, and they create the organizational structure to support it. And then in the 2nd year, while they're implementing, they target the rest of the school. So in the 3rd year, they're implementing school-wide. We've learned that if a principal moves, if key teachers change, it can threaten the stability of the implementation in the 3rd year. So we really want to have some kind of support planned for 2 more years after that to help the school sustain what they've learned. So making the change. This is about change, and it's not easy, and schools need support. I've never seen a school or a district go through this process without outside help. My organization is a technical assistance and training organization, and we've worked with several districts in implementing this kind of approach. There are other organizations. Leanne Woodley, who's going to speak after me, she and her organization in New South Wales also provides a similar kind of training and support. But outside partnership for technical assistance seems to be pretty critical. In the 1st year, teams need to engage in some kind of a self-assessment. We have quality indicators of inclusive schools. We have a belief survey. We want to look at student data. Leanne is going to talk or mention a tool that she has adapted from the Swift Center. We want to look at who the students are and where are they and what are the characteristics that they bring to the table. And then in that first year, by the end of that first year, we want to establish our priorities. Who are the grades that are going to be targeted? Who are the students? How are we going to engage families? We need to include families in that discussion. What practices need to change? What do teachers need to do differently? What skills do they need to develop? And how are we going to schedule things so that teachers have planning time in the year ahead? We know, as we're working with teachers, that there's more that teachers who are special in general need to learn together than they need to learn differently. There are some things that general education teachers will be more skilled at than special educators and vice versa. But the majority of skills needed for an inclusive classroom need to be known by both special and general educators. So finally here I'm going to mention an example of a planning form, and we have several different types of planning forms. In this one, like some of our others, we're going to look at the expectations for all students. So say I have a student in that 4th grade class who has Down syndrome and has an intellectual disability. So in working with the 4th grade teacher and the special educator and perhaps the speech therapist, we'll say, well, in the upcoming unit that you have, what are the numeracy academic goals? What do you expect to be teaching your students? In science, what are the academic goals that you have coming up? In the hallway, what are the behavioral goals? In social studies, how do you expect students to participate? So we ask these questions, and we're asking about expectations for all students. Sometimes we learn, especially if we do something like this in high school, that different teachers who have different content areas have different expectations. That may be particularly important for a student who has trouble with transitions or trouble understanding the rules. Once we get the expectations down, we then want to ask about the student that we're concerned with. So for the individual student, what are the academic goals for that student? How do we expect that student to participate? Does that student have communication needs so that they can participate? And what are the adults going to be doing, if there are peers or adults, in order to support that? Now, you notice that I have peers there. Our research tells us over and over again that when peers are engaged in supporting each other, not just with and without disability, but peers teaching each other, the peer who is the teacher learns more. Just like any teacher will tell you, when they have to teach subject matter, they learn it better when they're teaching it than if they were just being a learner. So we could fill in this form with looking at numeracy skills and say the goal is multiplying a fraction by a whole number. And we're going to have whole group, small group, and independent work. And this is what we might expect of students. And in a cooperative group, students are supposed to ask questions, select assumptions. Whoops, sorry about that. Listen to others, make suggestions. So if we look at the this particular student, they're using a Prolo-Quo-to-Go, an augmentative communication system that uses pictures or typing to communicate. So that student is going to ask questions using their Prolo-Quo-to-Go, which means that the special educator would have programmed the communication device in order for them to be able to ask a question or for them to give an answer. So now we're going to roles and relationships. As we're thinking about roles and relationships when we schedule students in classrooms, we always begin with scheduling students across classes and not congregating students. But when we then look at the teachers, the number of teachers, special educators we have in the building, and how are we going to spread teachers, and we see sometimes, actually quite often, that students are spread across so many classes that the special educator cannot possibly collaborate with that many adults. So the compromise then is congregating students a little bit based on meeting instructional needs. So we might have, say, 3 students in a 4th grade with a reading disability. We may put them together during reading, and the special educator may co-teach every single day with that teacher in reading. Another classroom might have a student with autism and a student with ADHD, both of which require a fair amount of behavioral and emotional supports, and perhaps a little bit of modification of lessons. The special educator may consult with that teacher and go in that classroom once or twice a week to assess how the students are doing, make additional modifications, but may actually have in that class a lower student ratio because there's a need for the classroom teacher to provide a little bit of additional support. We may also look at how the peers are providing support in that classroom. So here we have both teacher prompts, and we hopefully will have some peer prompts. I want to end by giving you some feedback from parents. In one district where we worked with 30 schools, by the time we got through schools and were working at the high school level, there were some parents who about midway were very opposed. They saw what was happening and they were frightened. This one parent had a daughter who had very significant disabilities. And this is what you see here are her words and her description. She did not want her daughter in a regular class. She was afraid that they would make fun of her. And she kept saying, she can't do third grade work. Why would you put her in third grade? It didn't make any sense to her. And we recommended to the district that they respect the views of the family, because inclusion shouldn't be about making things more difficult for the family. But as the school was, and the district and all of the schools in the district were moving forward, there were fewer and fewer self-contained classes. So near the end of the process, she agreed to have her child in the regular school building, but not in the regular class. But she did say she could be in the cafeteria and go to assemblies. So little bit by little bit, her daughter participated a little bit more and more. And by the time her daughter was fully included, she could not have been happier. She said, "I didn't think my daughter could possibly gain for it, but she's the first person to eat her words." Her daughter is using a computer and learning some skills that her mother, frankly, never thought she would learn. She's not doing third grade work, and she's not communicating or walking, but she's communicating, but not like other third graders, but she is communicating more than she had been. And she's got a system in place to help her engage with her peers. So in this district, 700 students who were in a segregated facility are now included and did not have that experience before. So I want to thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I really appreciate your time, and I want to give it over to Family Advocacy, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Carol. And returning back to this side of the globe, let me introduce Leanne Woodley, who works as Senior Education Consultant for the Association for Independent Schools New South Wales. Passionate about universal design for learning. Leanne's going to fill us in on how this works over here. Thank you.
Always big shoes to follow Carol. Carol is a colleague of mine. I've been over to Maryland to visit her and to visit the schools that she's been working in, and likewise she's been over to Australia in March this year, and she's worked very closely with us at the Association of Independent Schools to help us build up our processes around inclusive practices. So I'm going to share with you today our journey. Have you seen the movie Hidden Figures? It's based on a true story of inspirational women who became leaders in their field despite their barriers of their gender, race and colour. Dorothy Vaughan worked at NASA in the 1960s. She knew the organisation's vision to get a man on the moon. But she was an insightful and forward thinker. She anticipated that for NASA to be able to reach that goal and to be able to use the newly invented IBM computer, that NASA would need a group of programmers. Despite the adversities at the segregated workplace, Dorothy remained solutions and future focused. She retrained her group of women as programmers. So when NASA realised that they had a problem, they needed people to operate that IBM computer, Dorothy and her team were ready and prepared with the solution. Dorothy Vaughan's story illustrates that leadership can come from anywhere within an organisation, that good leaders just need to be able to ask the hard questions, to upset the status quo, and to look beyond what seems impossible to make things very possible. This analogy drives me in my work as an educator. I believe that part of my role is to upset the status quo, to ask the hard questions, to disrupt the traditional ideas that often stifle thinking and attitudes around what is an inclusive practice. I ask myself these questions daily, and they underpin how I approach my work in schools. Do we want to settle for good inclusive practices? How can we make it better? But let's not settle on better. How can I make it the best it can be for the young people in our schools and for the educational outcomes? What are those hard questions that I need to ask to bring about effective and sustainable change? In response to the Australian Government's Student First reform agenda and the New South Wales Government's Great Teaching Inspired Learning Initiative, the AIS, the Association of Independent Schools New South Wales, launched its Partners in Education program. And part of this program was a project called Developing Whole School Practices for Inclusive Schooling. It became known as the Inclusive Schools Project. And this set me off into an unknown direction to find out what were the most current and evidence-based school-wide frameworks that would support the planning and evaluating of effective inclusive practices in schools. So I went out into the unknown and I went looking for a framework that would measure inclusivity and would guide schools in reflecting on their current practices, to help schools ask those hard questions of themselves, to upset the status quo in some very traditional schools, and to be able to find a way to move forward in developing inclusive practices. I really wanted to move past the research and theory and the big ideas into the practicalities and the actual doing in schools. My research led me to the University of Kansas and the Swift Centre, as Carol referred to, and there by the work of Professor Wayne Saylor and Dr. Amy McCart. They had brought together over 30 years of rigorous and extensive research and framed this into the essential components and elements of what truly makes an inclusive school. The end product is known as the School-Wide Integration Framework for Transformation, commonly known as SWIFT. I was granted an academic scholarship by the Association of Independent Schools in 2015, which enabled me to travel to the United States, where I was trained in the SWIFT framework, and I was able to visit schools and meet with Carol, and she took me to the schools that had been using this framework for a number of years. I also met there with teachers who were really working around inclusive practices, particularly with students with the most complex needs. I also undertook some study while I was there around the Universal Design for Learning framework, commonly known as UDL. When I told my teenage son I was going to America to study UDL, he was most excited and wanted to come with me. When I explained it wasn't the alcoholic cans of drink, he decided to stay here. But under the guidance of Dr. Carol Quirk and Dr. Louis Lord Nelson from the University of Kansas, they have become my SWIFT mentors, and they continue to provide me with support as we move ahead in adapting SWIFT for the use in the Australian school context. So what is SWIFT? The SWIFT Centre is committed to eliminating silos in education by bridging the barriers and the gaps between the general educators and special educators, and the structures and resources that often keep the two separated. These bridges lead to powerful learning opportunities for students and teachers. They promote active, engaged partnerships amongst families and community members, and they ensure that each and every student is a valued member of their school community and given the supports that they need to achieve both academically and socially. So a little bit more about SWIFT. SWIFT identifies 5 key domains that schools need in place to make sure that we have school-wide inclusive transformation. These are the 5 domains, and they are critical in transforming schools as places of true and authentic inclusion for each and every student. These 5 domains are integrated or blend together to create that inclusive school. Currently, AIS New South Wales is the only organisation outside of the United States that is using this framework. And the SWIFT Centre is following our work very, very closely to see how it translates into different educational contexts and international settings. The SWIFT framework has 5 domains and features. The first one is around leadership. Schools need to have strong, actively engaged leadership teams with a commitment to improving inclusive learning and teaching by creating systems that empower teachers and educators. There needs to be what was referred to as a multi-tiered systems of support. This is a continuum of research-based, school-wide practices based on data-driven decisions to support the academic and behavioural needs of all students. The integrated educational frameworks encompasses all stakeholders, everybody within a school, working towards that positive culture and ensuring full access for all students in order for them to participate in curriculum that's appropriate to their age and stage of schooling, including co-curricular activities. The next domain is around family and community engagement, the recognition that families and community members and schools form a partnership where each benefits from and supports each other. And the final area is around inclusive policies and practices. So up here you'll see the original features of this domain. However, we've had to rework those. So in consultation with the SWIFT Centre and Professor Wayne Saylor and the University of Kansas, we have been able to change this domain, tailor it to meet the Australian school context. So it's been changed to enable schools to reflect on their inclusive policies and practices and ensuring that schools are meeting their requirements under the Australia's disability legislation and state and territory curriculum advice, including ACARA and NESA guidelines to inform practices. So we have been able to develop this one to suit our school context. Underpinning the framework are the 6 technical assistance practices. These support the initial processes in schools to help them build and sustain change within their school and help them to scale up equity-based inclusion. These areas provide schools with the implementation processes that they need to take in order to transform their schools. So the SWIFT Centre has developed tools that enable schools to evaluate their inclusive practices. At the AIS, we have adapted this particular tool, which is called the SWIFT Fidelity Integrity Assessment, known as the SWIFT FIA. It's a self-assessment tool and it's used by leadership teams to examine the current practices of their school and to demonstrate through research whether they actually do provide that inclusive education for all students. The SWIFT FIA has a structured conversation accompanied by a review of the evidence collected at schools, and they rate themselves according to the evidence. we felt that this tool was a good one that helped us work alongside schools rather than coming in and judging schools. So this is how we use the SWIFT FIA in our sector at the moment. We have identified schools or invited schools to become part of our Inclusive Schools project. And we gather data from all stakeholders within that school community. So we begin by collecting survey data that is aligned to the SWIFT domains and features. Survey data is collected from students, parents, all staff and school leaders. From there we take on focus groups. So we have focus groups of students with and without needs. We invite parents to come along, parents whose children do have a disability and parents who don't have children with disabilities, so we hear both sets of voices. We interview class teachers, learning support staff, school leaders. From there we bring together all of this qualitative and quantitative data into a report that we use and we present to the schools. From there a school leadership team will come together and we will facilitate the SWIFT FIA. And we allow schools to measure themselves. This enables schools to highlight areas that they're doing very well in, and we celebrate those successes. And it also allows schools then to identify areas for improvement. The school then scores themselves on a rubric for each domain. And then we move into the planning stage. So we support schools then to develop strategic plans to help them become more inclusive in the domain that they have chosen. So here's an example of the domain that links into leadership. You can't read that, but this is what it says. In summary, it says, our school has a leadership team that has a vision and is able to implement sustained systems for transformation. So there is a scoring system there. Laying the foundation means that you are just beginning to put together a leadership team that is able to transform practices within your school. Installing, through to implementing, and then through to sustaining school-wide implementation. And there's a descriptor there, so for the teachers in the room, you'd be used to using rubrics. So the schools use the data from the surveys and the focus groups, and we facilitate the conversation, and schools will score themselves where they think they fit. And below there are some indicators as well that we work through. Once you score yourself on all the domains and all of the features, a scoring sheet looks like this. Schools love numerical data. This helps them come up with numerical data and that they can measure themselves on. So we look at the numerical data where they've scored themselves and we celebrate the areas that they've scored highly in. We praise the schools, we get them to put it in their newsletter. Then we look for areas where we can find quick wins, quick gains. And for us, we have found that it has been particularly around the disability legislation. So one of the elements that we have, or the features, is around schools' awareness and teachers' awareness of not only the disability standards for education, but also the compliance measures of those. And that's an area that schools score themselves low in, that schools don't have an understanding of that. But through some professional learning, some online training and some face-to-face workshops, we can get some quick wins in raising awareness amongst the whole staff around disability legislation and what the obligations of teachers are in providing adjustments for young people. Particularly in high school, the biggest area we are finding is around assessment practices. But there's a HSC, so we can't make adjustments to assessment. So we remind them just by actually saying that, that's an example of direct discrimination. And so we kind of unpack what that might look like in a classroom situation. So the scoring helps us then identify areas that the school would like to work on. The schools choose a domain, right? So we're trying to build in sustainability and capacity. From here, you'll see a sample here. Most schools that we've worked with over the course of the last 18 months have chosen multi-tiered systems of support, the core feature being around inclusive academic instruction, and the item for improvement is around academic supports. So we ask the schools to notate down what their current situation is and why they have chosen that. From there, we work with the schools and we develop an action plan. And it's quite detailed and specific with actions and evidence of impact. How are we going to know that this is going to make a difference and improve the educational outcomes for students in your school? And so we've been working with schools around this for the last 18 months. And just this term, we are going back and we are redoing the SWIFT FIA with our first round of schools, and we're finding that they can see the improvements that they've made. The nice thing about the SWIFT FIA is it's not just around students with disabilities, it's around inclusive practices for all people. As Carol mentioned, each and every student within your school. In your packages, you will see a SWIFT flyer, and on it you'll see a website called swiftschools.org, and you can go and download the SWIFT FIA, the version from America, and you can get a feel for the tool yourself. As part of our project, we have been working with Associate Professor David Evans from the University of Sydney as our external evaluator. So he's been coming in and working with us to maintain the rigour of the tool and the way that we have been working for research purposes. And from his last midterm report, these were some of the comments that he had made around the use of the FIA, that the shift of us using the FIA has provided greater detail about the manner in which schools are examining their concept of inclusive education. So the tool is actually allowing schools to think more broadly and more widely about what it is to be an inclusive school. It's not just placement, or it's not we enrol students with disabilities, therefore we're inclusive. That is a lot more than that. So it's helping them unpack and understand what that means. Working closely with leadership teams, he said in his evaluation of our work that schools are obviously getting a much deeper understanding, and has helped guide our project in a lot refined way. So working with the SWIFT framework has enabled us to work with schools in a positive and a non-judgmental way. We're able to influence school leaders to move forward towards that common vision and understanding of what an inclusive school should look like. It has supported us to take action in a collaborative way, walking alongside schools in that journey towards inclusivity. Just like Dorothy Vaughan, we have found that the best leaders have come from anywhere within an organisation or a school, that merely having a leadership title does not constitute an effective leader. Sometimes we've found all it takes is that single class teacher to seize an opportunity, to change their class practice, to make a curriculum adjustment, to design an assessment practice differently, to be aware of the potential barriers a student might have and plan around these proactively, to show some empathy, to read a recent journal article, that teacher to ask the hard questions in the staff room, and that teacher begins to upset the status quo. So I will continue in my work to upset the status quo, and I will continue to work towards making the impossible possible.
Thank you, Leanne. Upsetting the status quo. So we're going to head off to afternoon tea now. I think everyone will need a break. At this point, I'm actually going to be stepping down from the MC role and handing off to Karen Tippett, who is our Advocacy Leadership and Development Manager at Family Advocacy. I'll still be up here. I'm going to slide on into the panel discussion, so I can't actually do both. So thank you everyone for putting up with me, and I'll see you after the job. Thank you.